Let's look at some of the most famous and important swords from Africa. Hi folks, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria and also Easton Antique Arms. I'm an antique weapons dealer and student, and I teach people how to use weapons as well. Now primarily I'm usually looking at European and sometimes Indo-Persian arms and armour on this channel, but a topic which doesn't get anywhere near enough attention, I don't think, are African weapons in general, but African swords. So obviously Africa has a rich and very, very long, going far back into ancient history, with different types of weapons and different types of sword as well. And some of the types of sword which are still around in Africa today, or certainly were still around, still being used in the 19th and early 20th centuries, actually have very old ancestries, and we'll look about that in a sort of light touch way in this video. But what we're going to look at here is 15 types of African sword. You might know some of them, you might not know any of them, you might know all of them, but 15 types of African sword that you should know about and were really important with different cultures and peoples in Africa. And we're going to be specifically looking at post-medieval, by European standards, swords, so from the 16th century kind of onwards. We're not going to be looking at knives and daggers here, and I'm not going to be looking at throwing knives, even though some of them are pretty long and basically sword length. We're just going to look more or less at swords to be used in the hand. And we're not going to be looking at spears, despite the fact that some African spears have blades as long as some swords. For example, certain types of Maasai spear, and indeed the ikloa as well from South Africa. We're just going to look at what most people would regard as a sword. 15 examples. And also to mention, there are some fantastic resources where you can learn more about African weapons. There's a whole bunch of books. I've got 2 examples. This is massive. It's part of a 2-volume work. Islamic and Native Weapons of Colonial Africa, 1800 to 1960 by Anthony Tirri, T-I-R-R-I. And this is African Arms and Armour by Christopher Spring. And there's a bunch of other similarly good books. And also you need to check out the HAMA, the Historical African Martial Arts Association, that is very much like what we do in HEMA, but for African martial arts and looking at traditional African weapons and in many cases surviving traditions of weapon use. Now just before I go on, I want to mention that this video is very kindly sponsored by Wondrium, formerly known as the Great Courses Plus, and I've got a very special offer for you, a free trial here, which why wouldn't you take advantage of that? But also to remind you, of course, it's the giving season, it's the festive season, and this would make a fantastic gift as well as subscription with Wondrium. I'm sure there are a lot of people you know in your lives who would really value this. Now I bet if you're watching my video here, you love learning new stuff, and that's one of the greatest things about Wondrium. It's got over 6,000 hours of video documentaries and courses that you can look at, and one of the great things is you can explore something more that you know a bit about and want to learn more about, or you can just go and learn about something completely new. And in fact, that's what I've been doing here. I've been learning about African mythology, which I think is very pertinent to the video that I'm making here, because the mythology of Africa and different regions, different cultures of Africa has a very direct relationship with the weapons and the styles and the decorations on weapons in those particular areas. One of the unusual things about Wondrium is the huge diversity of topics that you can study on there. And one of the great things is there are new courses by new lecturers being added constantly, all the time. And you can duck in and duck out anytime you want, anywhere you want, with your phone, your smartphone, your TV, your PC, your tablet, which means that you can drop into a course and then pause it and come back to it later whenever you like. The course I've been most recently watching is Great Mythologies of the World, and they have cut no corners with this. It's got a massive 60 chapters. For example, Dr. Julius H. Bailey does one about the beauty of African mythology, and this pivots around the mighty character of Shango, who is a sort of Zeus-like character who sends down lightning bolts onto mortals to punish them. But interestingly, his lightning bolts are represented by double-headed axes, very interesting, rather than arrows or spears more in European culture. So seriously, you're going to absolutely love Wondrium, or indeed one of your loved ones over the festive period will love it as a gift. You can try out the free trial. If you just want to try it out, no commitment whatsoever, then you can check out wondrium.com/Schola Gladiatoria, and that also helps the channel because it shows that people are watching my videos. You can click on the link right below here, or you can order a subscription for a friend or family. So thanks again to Wondrium for sponsoring this video. I hope you enjoy the video, hope you enjoy Wondrium. Check out that free trial now. So So thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the main topic of this video. So we're going to look at 15 types of African sword, very important and used over a fairly long period of time. And we're going to start in North Africa. And I'm not using any specific system geographically here. I'm just basically jumping around from different parts of Africa, but I'm going to say where each of these weapons is from. So first up we have the nimcha, and I think most of you probably will have heard of this sword. It's actually encountered quite a lot in antique collecting. There's a lot of them around. They come primarily from Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, so really the top of Africa there. And they're a form of saber. We don't exactly know where their roots lie, but I believe that it's in the 16th and 17th centuries, and these seem to be the earliest examples that really look exactly like a nimcha. And they're characterized by having a saber blade, usually a knuckle bow, and then forms of quillons, and they've got a very distinctive pommel shape. Sometimes they incorporate locally made blades, sometimes they're imported blades. They can either be from the Middle East, so Islamic countries, or they can be from Europe quite often as well. Now, next up is the flyssa. Again, I think most of you probably will have heard of the flyssa. It's actually quite a famous type of weapon that is found in Algeria, specifically of the Kabyle. I'm sorry if my pronunciation is terrible there. Kabyle people, and it's a weapon specifically associated with that culture. And this is a recurring theme we find when looking at African weapons. Often a specific weapon choice isn't just limited by geography, it's often limited by which people or ethnic group or sometimes religious group it's associated with. The flyssa is characteristic for having no real handguard to speak of, a grip a little bit like a yataghan or a kaiba knife, and a blade which very, very cleverly combines a long thrusting point with a swelling centre of percussion for cutting. And they can vary in length. They can be knife-sized all the way up to very long cavalry versions. Next up is the famous takouba, and I've got an example right here. I'm not sure of the age of this. It's probably early 20th century, but it's certainly got some age to it. And this is a particularly broad example. They're not normally quite as wide as this. And the takouba is characterised by this particular rectangular and flat type of crossguard here, and also this conical or flat style of pommel and a relatively short grip as well. Very often they have fairly rounded tips to the end of the blade and are not particularly pointy, although overall they tend to be tapered. As I mentioned, this is a particularly unusually broad example, which is why I've kept it in my collection, because it's quite odd. The blades can vary a lot. They can sometimes be locally made and sometimes they can be European imported blades, and they therefore vary quite a lot in proportions, length and size. Sometimes they have a fuller, sometimes they're quite narrow, sometimes they're more pointy. They vary, but the takouba is defined by this, and they're particularly associated with the central Sudan and particularly the Tuareg and also the Hausa peoples as well. So again, they're associated with ethnic groups, the Tuareg and the Hausa, and they're found in central Sudan and the Sahel. And this Tuareg sword, the takouba, seems to have its roots in the medieval period with straight double-edged swords that were used through a lot of North African Islamic kingdoms. Now, a type of sword which is fundamentally slightly similar to the takouba and is actually found in some of the same areas of the Sudan as well, and is sometimes confused with it, or one is confused with the other, is the kaskara. Now, the kaskara equally also has its roots in Islamic swords of North Africa of the medieval period, and actually it seems like they're kind of stuck in a time warp in a way, in that they're very, very similar in hilt design to certain types of sword we find used by the Mamluks in the medieval period, but they just stayed more or less unchanged. They did change in one way, somewhat, and that is the blade. Now, you might think, well, the blade looks like the versions seen in medieval art, and indeed fundamentally it is. It's a straight double-edged blade, usually with fullers, although not always. However, these blades were famously in the 19th and 18th century as well, often European made, very often German made in Solingen, and they were imported into the Sudan and Egypt and traded for things in return. So this type of blade, very often European made. However, this example here is probably not German made, and equally the other example I've got here, which is slightly narrower, is probably also local made. So they were also making them locally. And the kaskara is dictated by this style of crossguard with the characteristic languette coming down here, which goes either side of the scabbard, a cylindrical grip and a disc-like pommel, which is actually made of leather wrapped around. It's not a metal or anything like that, it's just a wooden grip and then build up of leather to form a sort of disc pommel, not as big as the takoubas. And they're also characterized by this flaring shape to the scabbard as well, which we find on certain other swords, which we'll see here as well, and that doesn't reflect the shape of the blade inside. The blade inside, of course, is straight. So the kaskara, an incredibly famous and often encountered due to colonial activities essentially in the Sudan and Egypt, and this is found used by all sorts of people, including the Hadendawa, the Beja, and these sorts of people in the Sudan right the way up to the 20th century, but probably going back for centuries before that. And in a modern geographic definition, it's found in the Sudan, Chad and Eritrea. Now, I mentioned that flare on the scabbard, and another type of sword that we find from Africa that has that similar flare is from a similar area, the Sudan, and it's the manding. So the manding sword used by the manding warriors, it usually involves an imported saber blade married to a locally made hilt and a locally made scabbard. Now, very often on antique examples of this, we find that they are French cavalry saber blades, usually that have been shortened down either at the hilt end or tang end, and sometimes at the point end, and they've been married with a leather wrapped grip essentially with ribs on it, and a scabbard of a similar style to the kaskara. The manding's found in the western Sudan, and as mentioned, it featuring imported European blades. The blades can be of numerous different types: cutlass blades, saber blades, and you sometimes find some historically important blades that have been chopped down and made into manding swords, so they were presumably being used as trade goods. It's a little bit difficult knowing exactly when the manding originates, but I think it's probably a 19th century invention, possibly late 18th century, because they mostly feature European blades of these dates. Now, an absolutely fascinating sword from the Kingdom of Benin, or the Empire of Benin, is the Ada, also known as the Amozo. Now, we often find with African swords you have different names, and I'm not sure what the difference is between an Ada and an Amozo, or if they're just two names for the same thing, or if indeed they were just two slightly different geographic names for it, but we often find this with African weapons. But in this case, what is the actual sword we're talking about? It essentially has a swollen and curved tip that is particularly powerful for chopping, and then it usually has a hilt which is confined and has a sort of disc-like top and bottom to it, a little bit like a Nepalese kora. And in fact, overall, it has a similar sort of look and shape to a Nepalese kora. So it seems to be a very powerful chopping sword, and they retained and still retain a ceremonial purpose. So some of them are very ornate, some of them are very oversized, but nevertheless, it was clearly used as a weapon of war and executions as well. And so they came in a variety of sizes and a variety of different shapes and different types of decoration. Next up is the afena, or akrafena as it's sometimes known. Again, two different names seem to refer to the same thing, or at least similar things. They come in a variety of sizes. Some are massive, some have multiple blades, some have multiple hilts, but these are ceremonial ones. The standard form, and this is shown in art, and this is from the Asante culture, incidentally, in what's the Gold Coast, was known as the Gold Coast. So we're talking about around Ghana, West Africa now, and they are characterized by having a large, we could say machete-ish shaped blade, a bit bigger than a machete normally is, and then with two balls essentially at the top and bottom of the grip, and a cylindrical grip in the middle. The grips are usually quite short, and usually that hilt is made of wood, and very often in the high status ones it's covered with gold leaf. The Gold Coast, surprisingly not, was famous for its gold, so they had lots of gold to spare, and they covered the hilts of their swords with gold. But there are also varieties which have shagreen or shark skin, ray skin, stretched over them rather than having gold. And the blades sometimes are perforated and sometimes have funky little shapes on the edges, but very often have perforations in them. These are quite big, cleaving weapons with a very unusual and characteristic hilt design. Now, a possibly related sword to the afena is from the neighbouring Dahomey culture, and they use a sword which I'm calling here the Hui sword. However, I think it went by a number of different names. So again, the naming is somewhat obscure and somewhat complicated, but we'll call it the Hui sword here. And this is characterized by a blade which overall has a similar kind of silhouette to the Asante afena sword. However, it usually has, or certainly the surviving examples, often have decoration in terms of mythological or legendary creatures and events on the back edge of the flared tip of the blade. Very interesting feature, which makes them very popular amongst art collectors. And the hilts are somewhat different. So while the blades are perhaps similar to the afena, the hilts are completely different. And the hilts, certainly in the 19th century, seem to almost follow or emulate European cutlass and saber hilts. So they start out with a simple wooden grip with usually a kind of animal form or twisted forward pommel, but they often end up with forms of quillon or knuckle bow added to them later on. Now here we've got an absolutely awesome sword that I'm a big fan of, and again is very popular amongst modern art collectors, which is the ngombe, which is from the Congo and northwest Zaire, we could say. And this is characterized by essentially having no guard in front of the hand, but a sort of ornate pommel and quite a small grip. And then the blade is a wonderful funky shape that is somewhat reminiscent of some of the African throwing knives, so-called throwing knives, that were often used as hand weapons incidentally. And it has a crescent type blade at the top, which you can use either like an axe on one side, or usually they're edged on both sides. You can use them like a sickle on the inside, or the piercing tip is a bit like a war hammer. So there's actually quite a lot of options with this weapon, using it whichever way round, or using it with a back edge cut or back edge blow, or hooking or this kind of thing as well. So a really fascinating weapon, usually quite heavy but not terribly long. Would give absolutely horrific wounds, I would think, but that's true of pretty much most weapons being considered here. And there is a ceremonial or perhaps high status version which has a symmetrical double crescent blade at the top, which it's the same weapon, it's still classed as a ngombe, and it's still from the same areas, but it seems to have been perhaps used in executions or carried by kings, this kind of thing. So it's like an exaggerated high status version. It might even allude to certain African mythology and stories about double-headed axes. These ngombes are often also enhanced by having engraved decoration all over their blade surfaces, which presumably show stories and things that would have meant something to the cultures that they're wielded by. So stories and creatures that they know all about. Now if we move to southern Zaire, there's a perhaps related weapon, maybe they have a common ancestor with the ngombe, and this is called the Kuba. Now I can't explain why, but I'm a particular fan of the Kuba. I just love the look of it. It looks brutal, but it's also relatively simple, so it's more or less symmetrical. In fact, most of the examples I've seen are symmetrical, and it has two projecting points, it's edged on both sides, and it has a large crescent type tip, which would in theory make it useless for thrusting in a stabbing sense, but of course it could be edged and you can of course do damage with that tip as well. The grip is usually made of wood, sometimes leather wrapped, and it's usually pretty short and pretty simple, but overall I absolutely love the shape of the Kuba. And obviously that shape of tip can be used for piercing, particularly good for piercing through types of armour. Some people were wearing certain types of armour in these regions, or equally for hooking, so for hooking the edge of someone's shield or controlling someone's spear shaft, this kind of thing. So hooking, hacking, piercing, very simple but very effective weapon. Now next up is the absolutely incredible mambele sword, which is used by in northern Zaire, northeast Zaire, by the Asante and the Boa peoples. And this sword is, you could fundamentally call it a sickle sword, and there'll be another similar-ish example to this that we'll be seeing in a minute. However, if you actually look at some of the details of this sword, it's possible, only possible, that this owes its origin to the Egyptian khopesh, and I think it's not impossible that there is some relationship there. Nevertheless, it's essentially usually a double-edged sickle-shaped sword. It can be used to chop on the outside curve or the inside curve with a very particular style of flared tip that can be used for piercing, potentially could be used for hooking as well. But one of the characteristic things about it that makes it different to other sickle swords found in Africa is that it usually has this projection just above the hilt that could be used for guarding, it could be used for hooking, could be used for hooking an opponent's shield aside, or it might be to prevent another person's weapon sliding down. Perhaps it's for control. So a very, very interesting and detailed specific design that looks like, rather than just having symbolic meaning behind the design, that it actually has some specific purposes behind some of those features. Now that other type of sickle sword that I referred to a second ago, I'm sure most of you will have immediately realised what I was referring to, and that's the Shotel from Ethiopia. Now the Shotel is probably one of the most famous African swords alongside the takouba and the kaskara from Africa, and the Ethiopians used them for a long, long period of time, most famously against the Italian colonial forces as well. And very interestingly, they're edged on both sides, so they're not used exactly like a sickle. You can use the inside curve, but you also use the outside curve. And from art surviving from the period showing Ethiopian warriors attacking Italian forces, they seem to have predominantly used the outwards curve for striking with, kind of like a saber, I guess. But clearly that point can be used for piercing, perhaps through shields, perhaps through armour. Also coming around someone's guard, so if someone goes to block either with a shield or with their weapon shaft or whatever, that point will come around and hit them anyway. And equally it could be used for hooking legs, shields, weapons, back of someone's neck, whatever. So a very versatile sword, very particular style sword. So intriguing, in fact, that certain French officers, even, and in one case British officer, even emulated the style of blade on their officers' swords. So clearly very intriguing design, and clearly very successful for the Ethiopians because they stuck with it for a long time. Grip, very, very simple, just made of wood usually. Sometimes you get ornate versions, but a relatively simple short grip, and fascinating weapon design. Very, very intriguing, and I would love to learn more about how exactly these were used. And I should also mention there is a straighter version which I believe is called a garude, or something like this anyway. So there are less curved versions which are more like sabers. And in Ethiopia they did also import European saber blades, so it's possible that what they are is a halfway house between the traditional Shotel and the imported European saber blades, and the garude, and they wanted something that I guess was halfway between the two. But nevertheless, not all of them have a huge curve, some of them are less curved than others. The big difference with the mambele is the mambele has a flared, swollen tip, and the Shotel has a very narrow pointed tip, so that clearly indicates towards a difference of use or a difference of target perhaps. So next up is the Ol Alem, which is a type of short sword used famously by the Maasai, and in fact tons of these have ended up in Western countries because they're brought back by tourists, quite simply. But what's an interesting feature about them is there are two types you commonly encounter. They're essentially a type of double-edged short sword, large knife, carried at the hip, and you encounter some which have a midrib and some which are flat. Now the flat ones are almost always imported blades, very often British made. You sometimes find the maker Martindale actually on the steel of the blade. They were just chopped down machete blades, or specifically in some cases they made those blades in Britain and other countries like France and imported them into country as trade goods. But the traditionally made ones are mid-ribbed and hollow ground, a very specific design which to me implies more of a thrusting design than a cutting design. So if you look at the modern ones, they have more of the feel of a machete, a chopping implement, whereas if you look at the older ones, they tend to be narrower, more elongated with a stronger midrib, which, as I say, hints more of a thrusting weapon. And it should be pointed out that the Maasai were using these with very large shields and very large spears, so these were very much backup weapons used probably like a dagger in a close kind of grappling situation after you'd come too close to use the spear and the shield effectively. Next up is the gile or gile. I think there's two different ways of saying it. There might even be other names for it as well. Again, when we're rendering into English or French, these names for native weapons that don't necessarily always marry up. And these are found primarily in Djibouti, Ethiopia and Somalia. Perhaps most famously in Somalia, because Ethiopia has weapons which are perhaps more famous to Ethiopia. So I think in the modern world we mostly encounter the gile from Somalia, and in fact even in Somalia today they are still being made, they're still being worn by traditional groups in agricultural areas. So you can still see people with a modern military rifle and wearing their gile. In the modern world, the blades are often made of things like saw blades and other kind of tool blades repurposed, reforged. Traditionally, they were forged with, I would say, more complex geometry, usually more fullers and things like this. The modern blades tend to be a bit flat because they're repurposing modern blades, whereas with the old ones, made in the 19th century and earlier, the characteristically angled blade very often has interesting incised detailing and fullers in the blade. The hilts are usually pretty basic in overall shape, a kind of capital I shape, but they are sometimes enhanced with decorations. Sometimes they're made of more exotic materials like rhino horn or ivory. Usually they're wood, and then they sometimes have metal applied to the outside of them as decoration. And finally we have the belawa or balao, spelt differently again in different languages. The French tend to spell it differently to the English for obvious reasons. But fundamentally this is a straight double-edged sword with a fairly minimal hilt. It has almost a slight look of a Roman gladius to it at first look, an early one, but it's not really in proportions. I have actually had one of these in my collection in the past. I don't have it now, unfortunately. And they usually have alloy fittings on the tang, most characteristically with a spiky, pointy type pommel. Sometimes it has one pyramidal point, sometimes it has 3 points. I suspect this probably relates to slightly different tribal groups, slightly different geographic regions, although I don't know the details of that. The blades are about the size of a gladius. They're basically a short sword, and interestingly, a lot of the examples that I've seen myself, the point is not necessarily in the middle. The point is often slightly asymmetrical, and the blades tend to be fairly flat with simple beveled edges. So this brings us to an end of 15 iconic and famous types of African sword that you might encounter either if you're reading books about it or reading historical accounts set in Africa, or indeed if you're a collector of antiques or looking in museums or art galleries. These are 15 types of African sword you should learn the name of, and hopefully this video has been helpful with that and also helping you understand where some of them are from. I might go into further detail in some of these swords cases because some of them are extremely interesting, and as you've seen, I've got a few examples in my collection. There are some here that I would dearly love to get into my collection, but I haven't yet been able to. But I hope that's been interesting, and I hope it shed a little bit more light for the average viewer on the internet on African swords, because it is actually a massively interesting topic, and there's a huge amount more that we could say about African swords, and we should be doing, because it's a somewhat neglected topic, I think, in the world of sword study. So let's change that. I hope you've enjoyed this video. As always, check out the links below. Please give me a like, because it makes a big difference to my motivation and feelings of self-worth. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so, because then you'll get notifications about upcoming videos that could be on any sort of topic that might interest you. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope I'll see you again soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.